Hello and welcome to Strifelon on Cinema. I'm Strifelon, and I'm starting up this channel because I think about movies a lot. Probably too much. This is my first video essay, so please bear with me. It's probably incredibly messy and all over the place, but I really want to discuss The Wizard of Oz, which seems like this all-encompassing, giant property that speaks volumes to American popular culture. But especially recently, with the release of the Wicked films, the aesthetics and themes of Wizard of Oz have been more relevant than ever. I'd recommend Matt Bernstein's video on Wicked, as I think that does a really good job of tying the story of Wicked to the current scapegoating of trans people in United States politics. But while there's already hundreds and thousands of videos out there exploring political and queer themes in Wicked and Wizard of Oz, I wanted to do a historical look into the past century of Wizard of Oz media to examine how the franchise has reflected gender transitions in the public eye. Between books, movies, and stage shows, The Wizard of Oz has inhabited nearly every area of popular media consumption. I think that by looking at the history of these stories between different mediums over the past century reveals exactly why the franchise resonates so deeply in queer spaces. Specifically, as the property's longevity relies on an adaptability to political contexts and gender expectations, I'm going to argue that this process of adaptation creates transgender narratives. And I'll also look forward to how Wicked for Good can play a role in furthering these overarching themes later this year. Going back to the very beginning, the first book in the Oz series, L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from 1900, was itself released at a transitional approach to children's literature. Moving out of the Victorian era into the 20th century, books such as Alice in Wonderland shifted children's literature from instructional texts to pieces of entertainment. As entertaining children's literature took hold, the stories began to focus on an adventure narrative, and this adventure narrative very quickly became coded as masculine. But Baum was very interested in creating hyper-modern stories. Baum's introduction to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz reflects this shift in his focus on modernity, as he writes, "Modern education includes morality. Therefore, the modern child seeks only entertainment in its wonder tales and gladly dispenses all disagreeable incident." Baum's focus on modernity as it pertains to children's literature also proves essential to his formation of Oz as a neo-fairyland with contemporary mythology. As a girl taking on a role traditionally occupied by boys in this adventure subgenre of children's literature, Dorothy's journey to Oz functions as an experience shaping transitional femininity in the children's literature genre. I feel as though in children's literature, the child protagonist tends to start as an androgynous blank slate of sorts, and it's through their journey that they transition either into their expected gender roles or into this genderqueer role of individualism. Victorian era and 20th century children's literature especially conflates the transition from childhood into adulthood with transition of gender roles, and this rests at the heart of Baum's intentions with gender in The Wizard of Oz. When L. Frank Baum moved to Chicago in 1891, he became increasingly involved in the women's suffrage movement, which is reflected in his time working on advertisements that centered around the presentation of female signifiers. Baum's fascination with the evolving female image was essential to his 20th century capitalist mindset, and is ultimately what led way to his characterization of Dorothy. Perhaps it was this fascination with the idea of the image within a capitalist structure that led to Baum's fascination with multimedia storytelling as well. Because just 2 years after The Wonderful Wizard of Oz's release, a stage adaptation of the story premiered in Chicago, moving to Broadway just another year later in 1903. This stage play had some noticeable differences from the book, most blatantly, some of the worst music I've ever heard.
With marvelous dexterity, each night at 9:30.
But also, in terms of Dorothy's characterization. I think it's fascinating that instead of being transported to Oz in her house, Dorothy gets transported to Oz on a hay bale. While this was likely done for the practical limitations of moving a house across the stage, it shows that, to L. Frank Baum, the domestic space perhaps wasn't as essential to Dorothy's characterization as it now seems. With the stage play itself being adapted into a silent short in 1910, the Wizard of Oz myth was being adapted at a faster pace than any prior children's literature, as it spread to nearly every populous medium within less than a decade. Other early adaptations of The Wizard of Oz included L. Frank Baum's ill-fated film production studio, and his successful sequels such as 1904's The Marvelous Land of Oz, which notably features a transgender character. Following a young boy from Oz named Tip on a journey to rescue the Princess Ozma, it's revealed that Tip is, in fact, Princess Ozma themselves, and a witch had trapped her in a boy's body. With pretty much no hesitation, Tip accepts the transformation back into a woman and truly, sincerely, slays so hard in her ruling of Oz. She even kisses Dorothy once. However, while pieces of this story were adapted into various films years later, most notably with Disney's Return to Oz, Ozma's gender transition is notably absent from these stories. Although it's unlikely that L. Frank Baum wrote Princess Ozma to be a trans character, it's important to see how the overt hypersexualization and fetishization of transgender characters in Hollywood cinema through the 20th century hindered Princess Ozma's chance of having a transgender narrative be told through the genre of family cinema. Ultimately, while trans representation was already sparse at this time, representation in children's media was entirely non-existent, which made Baum's writing in 1904 a unique relic of a, perhaps naively, accepting transgender narrative that was gone all too soon. Of course, in discussing conservatism's impact on the story, it's pretty much impossible to avoid the cultural stronghold of MGM's 1939 film, in which Dorothy's submissive domestic feminine identity is turned up to 11. I think this is most evident in the film's 20-minute introduction in Kansas, compared to the 4 pages spent in Kansas in the book. As both pieces take place in 1890s America, the contemporary dreariness of Baum's writing strongly contradicts Victor Fleming's romanticized and nostalgic Kansas. From this, the audience also identifies with Dorothy much stronger than the rose-tinted filmmaker's gaze of the film. Baum writes that Dorothy could see nothing but gray prairie on every side. Even the grass was not green, for the sun had burned the tops of the long blades until they were the same gray color. Meanwhile, the film uses a warm brown sepia tone filter that makes it so even when Dorothy sings about yearning to leave Kansas, there's a distinctly homely and cozy atmosphere to the Kansas sections of the film. This nostalgia masks many of the more blatant political allegories that Baum reached for in his novel, especially concerned with gender. As Gretchen Ritter writes, "The way in which the politics of the 1890s was remembered by the generation of the late 1930s meant that many of the references and metaphors had been forgotten." Transitioning the gaze of the 1890s to a reflexive aesthetic for Kansas imbues the 1939 film with an adoration for the domestic space in Kansas, which is absent from Dorothy's perspective in Baum's 1900 novel. Most notably, though, this strips Dorothy of a lot of her agency in the book and film. Especially as Wizard of Oz acts as the pinnacle of production code era aesthetics, it's worthwhile examining how Hollywood's increased conservatism quite directly impact the depictions of Dorothy's gender. This continues in the film's conclusion, which changes Oz to be a dream state rather than an actual journey. While Baum's Dorothy physically left the domestic space to go through a process of growth, it's implied that 1939's Dorothy never left home in the first place, as she proclaims in her final melodramatic monologue,
"Oh, but anyway, Toto, we're home. Home. And this is my room. And you're all here. And I'm not going to leave here ever, ever again. Because I love you all. And, oh, Auntie M, there's no place like home."
While both Dorothys display affection for the domestic space, the 1939 film implies that Dorothy outright resents Oz. Meanwhile, 1900 Dorothy seems to recognize her growth as a result of the adventure she chose to partake in, embracing her lessons from leaving home to venture into the unknown land of Oz. Though subtle, this distinction between 1900 and 1939 highlights how Baum's eager age of suffrage-era feminism transitioned to an increasingly conservative political climate come the 1939 film's release. After the 1939 film, there was a cultural drought of sorts from Wizard of Oz media. While there were attempts, nothing quite reached the heights of the 1939 film or the 1900 novel. At this time, though, the 1939 film was constantly being appropriated and reappropriated to adapt with shifts in culture as it gained popularity on its TV reruns. The 1939 film only gained its cultural relevancy through the mid-20th century, and I think a lot of that has to do with increased gender conservatism. Most prevalent in the 1950s, with media enforcing conservative American stereotypes of a nuclear family, Dorothy's submissive and domestic femininity in the 1939 films seems readily applicable to the current public's needs. Ultimately, as these reruns continued, the 1939 film overshadowed Baum's book in the cultural memory, which led to Gregory Maguire's 1995 book, Wicked, which empathizes with the Wicked Witch, now named Elphaba. Wicked contextualizes Elphaba's ostracization in Oz to racialized and queered themes that resonated more with an increasingly progressive early 21st century audience. However, in contrast to the other Wizard of Oz media that came before it, Wicked shifts the target demographic to an older adult readership, undermining much of the social change that it champions. As I mentioned briefly earlier, there's a unique gatekeeping approach to queer themes that became especially prevalent at this time, in which queerness was tied to adultness. Wicked only perpetuates this, as although Elphaba is introduced as an intersex and queer woman, these elements of her identity are constantly tied to these hypersexual scenes. And look, I love reading steamy descriptions of Fiyero just as much as the next person. Jonathan Bailey, hit me up anytime, any place. But I think that this does genuine harm to the cultural understandings of queerness if it can only be approached from this adult perspective. In a similar vein to the way Baum tied Dorothy's agency to the women's suffrage movement, 21st century queer rights heavily influenced Elphaba's queerness, with the US legalizing gay marriage in 2015. Most notably, these themes manifest in the implied romantic relationships between Elphaba and Glinda as a departure from the heteronormative ideals of domestic and romantic spaces. The book perhaps exemplifies this relationship most clearly, as Glinda and Elphaba share an intimate kiss before leaving for the Emerald City. And look, you can say what you will about this being queerbaiting, but when Gregory Maguire writes that Elphaba put her face against Glinda's and kissed her, saying, "Hold out if you can," and kissed her again, "Hold out, my sweet," I don't even know what to tell you. Despite this somewhat explicit queerness in Gregory Maguire's novel, Wicked's musical theater and film adaptations, which were more directly aimed at children and family audiences, strip Elphaba of her queer sexuality and intersex identity. Rather, Elphaba in the populist mediums must conform to many of the stereotypical signifiers of femininity perpetuated in works such as the 1939 film. While her independence from the domestic space is celebrated in modern Wicked, the heightened popularity of both musical theater and film over novels meant that Elphaba had to be adapted to populist views of what a female protagonist should act like. That being said, Gelfie isn't entirely devoid from these films, as we all know. The relationship becomes coded into the medium of the musical itself. Schwartz's music utilizes a 1950s romance musical structure, with Elphaba and Glinda positioned as the romantic leads. Songs such as What Is This Feeling specifically play into this relationship, as both Glinda and Elphaba sing,
"What is this feeling, so sudden and new?
I felt the moment I laid eyes on you.
My pulse is rushing.
My head is reeling.
Yeah, well, my face is flushing. What is this feeling, the fervent as a flame? Does it have a name? Yes, loathing."
If that's not gay, then literally what are we doing here? And if you want to get even gayer, just listen to 5 seconds of For Good and tell me it doesn't make you want to cry in fetal position while wrapped in a pride flag. In What Is This Feeling, as Elphaba and Glinda misinterpret their clear romantic feelings as loathing, this satirizes the love at first sight musical number in traditional musical theater, and underlies how the romantic connection functions like apathetic heterosexual couples from Golden Age Broadway. While Elphaba and Glinda's kiss is absent from the musical and film adaptations of Wicked, still alluding to their romance reflects the 21st century incursion of queerness into these romantic and domestic heterosexual spaces. In tracking the transitional gender of Elphaba through the past century, it becomes evident that her gender through the domestic space becomes a vehicle for empathization. In Baum's 1900 book, the Wicked Witch is deemed wicked as an older woman living in seclusion away from the expected domestic ideals that Dorothy represents. Bonnie Becker writes that Baum's coding of the Wicked Witch combines the female biology of the Wicked Witches with the masculine performance of men, and shows how this powerful position of women is viewed as ugly and wicked as it opposes the normality set by society. Acting in as a foil for Dorothy's hyper-feminized characterization, Baum's Wicked Witch perpetuates the ideal that acceptable femininity rests on conformity to domestic expectations. This narrative continues in the 1939 film, with the increased conservatism of Hollywood to weaponize this difference, as the Wicked Witch's agency gets in the way of Dorothy's return home, reflecting patriarchal fears of female independence prevalent at this time. By transitioning the level of threat posed by the Wicked Witch's dissociation from domestic ideals, her characterization mirrors societal expectations of women at the time for each text's release. Nearly 6 decades later, with Maguire's Wicked, the Wicked Witch became Elphaba, and her separation from the traditional domestic space became celebrated in her role as protagonist. Stripping her of hegemonic gender signifiers, Maguire casts an intersex and androgynous identity for Elphaba that challenges the reader's understanding of femininity. When Elphaba is born, the surrounding cast of characters initially take her to be a boy because of her genitalia. By detailing what makes the Wicked Witch ostracized from Oz through oppressive labels of gender based on sex organs, the book's audience must question their compliance with villainizing the Wicked Witch in the original story on the basis of her gender. The 2003 musical strips Elphaba of her intersex identity in favor of traditional femininity to appeal to family audiences in a more compliant children's literature format. While still painted as different from other inhabitants of Oz, her gender and sex transition to suit hegemonic definitions of cisgender and heterosexual femininity. Resulting from the popularity of the Wicked musical and film, the Oz mythology has become further adapted into fan fiction. Internet fan fiction allows fans to reclaim certain characters and self-canonize new paths for popular stories. Elphaba and Glinda's relationship from Wicked, entitled Gelfie by fans, has been one of the most popular relationships to explore in this medium. Transitioning away from the space of children's literature, the fanfiction genre as it applies to The Wizard of Oz centers on sexually explicit explorations of Elphaba and Glinda's relationship. Holly Pester examines how fanfiction problematizes interactions with the canon in the original text. She notes that such troubling of the economic and power structures that govern the original work from which fanfiction writers craft imagined realities is a clear example of how the innovation of desire-led and aberrant methods create material transformations. Enabling adult themes to be furthered as self-canonization through the increasing popularity of the fanfiction genre dismantles many of the hegemonic heteronormative themes tied to children's literature. However, there are signs that this could be changing for good. See what I did there? Although the two characters were not explicitly romantically involved in part 1 of the film, the increasing comments for the characters' queerness through the press interviews could pave the way for Wicked for Good to challenge the normative structure of the children's literature genre, to hold space for the queer domestic themes that Maguire's adult novel and Gelfie fanfiction so aptly captures. Transitioning between genres, mediums, and political ideologies, the Wizard of Oz canon utilizes the domestic space as a site to specifically shift approaches to gender that match the hegemonic and populist ideas of the surrounding political landscape. While Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from 1900 reflected an optimistic era of women's suffrage, MGM's The Wizard of Oz from 1939 leaned further into the story's themes of submissive domesticity and attached that theme as integral to Dorothy's identity. As feminist and queer movements made progress through the 20th century, Gregory Maguire's adaptation of the Oz story to an adult book with Wicked reflected these politics by queering Elphaba's femininity and cultivating a new space of domesticity in her relationship with Glinda. Yet, as Wicked itself was then adapted to a musical aimed at families in 2003, its queer themes were restrained by the confines of a genre aimed at perpetuating hegemonic ideals. Looking forward to the 2025 film, I honestly think that it's plausible that we get canonization of Gelfie. With expanding the story to a full 3 hours, like they did with the first film, there's going to be a lot that they want to add, and I think that the allusions made by Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo in their press interviews definitely imply that it's possible, and maybe I'm falling into queerbait again, which I am very susceptible to, but especially in this cultural moment with attacks on queer people, I think The Wizard of Oz is the perfect site to change the cultural dialogue on how we approach gender. And if anyone's gonna do it, it's gonna be Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande. But what do you all think? Let me know down in the comments, and that does it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Again, this was only my first video, so I know it's probably really messy, but I'm really hoping to get a start with this and hopefully make more content, as I'll be going to the Cannes Film Festival later this month, and I want to kind of establish myself a little bit before that. So let me know if you have any suggestions or any ideas on how I can improve my videos, and I will see you all next time. Thank you!
The aliens stole the asteroid.